I was on a business trip and left my 8-year-old daughter with my mom and sister. Then the hospital called. She's in critical condition after an accident. I called my mom. She laughed. No idea, maybe she ran oof. My sister said, she never listens. She asked for IT. I raced to the hospital, but I wasn't the one who ended up regretting it. Carol Warner loved the stillness of early mornings in New England. As the morning sun streamed through the windows of her upscale apartment, she carefully poured coffee into her cup while browsing through the latest issue of Biochemical Advances spread out on the kitchen counter. Her green eyes reflected a youthful curiosity, and her chestnut hair was styled in a neat short bob. "Mom, I can't solve this problem," came Samantha's slightly troubled voice from the living room table. Carol smiled and moved to her daughter's side, coffee cup in hand. 8-year-old Samantha had her father's thick brown hair and her mother's green eyes. Watching her daughter work so seriously on her math homework filled Carol's heart with joy. "Let me see," Carol said, checking the problem over her daughter's shoulder and beginning her explanation slowly. Though she routinely dealt with complex chemical formulas as a scientist, the challenge of teaching fractions to an 8-year-old sometimes felt more difficult than the toughest problems in her lab. "I get it." Samantha's face suddenly lit up as she began writing with her pencil. "This is how you do it." Carol nodded and gently stroked her daughter's head. "That's right. Well done." 3 years ago she had divorced her husband Michael, who had been deployed to Afghanistan as a military doctor. Their long separation had created a rift in their relationship, but they had managed to maintain a friendly connection for their daughter's sake. Michael faithfully kept his promise to video call their daughter once a month and visit twice a year during his leave. Her apartment in a quiet suburb of Boston wasn't spacious, but it was arranged with a simple, efficient design. Scientific degrees hung on the walls alongside photographs of Samantha's bright smile. "Grandma and Aunt Becky are coming today, aren't they?" Samantha asked. There was a subtle tension in her voice. Carol didn't miss it. "Yes, Grandma and Aunt Becky, and Jake too. We're having lunch together." Samantha nodded silently and returned to her homework. Carol momentarily felt something off about her daughter's reaction, but pushed it to the back of her mind. Family relationships were complicated, but on the surface, they maintained a semblance of harmony. Carol's mother Judith was a respected figure in the local social scene. After her husband's death, she had wisely invested the insurance money in assets, living without financial worries. Living alone in an old mansion in the Boston suburbs, she actively participated in charity work and church gatherings. "Carol is always so busy with her own affairs. That girl is too smart for her own good," Judith would say while telling her neighbors about her daughter's successes. But behind those words lurked subtle jealousy. She had once majored in chemistry in college herself, but had given up her dreams of research when she married and had children. Watching her daughter achieve the dreams she couldn't fulfill stirred complicated emotions. Meanwhile, Carol's sister Becky had experienced one divorce. She was a single mother raising her 10-year-old son Jake while working at a local real estate company. She was the type to attract attention with flashy clothes and makeup, and contrary to her bright exterior, she harbored deep dissatisfaction and jealousy. "My sister is always so perfect. I can't compare to her." Though her words seemed to praise her sister on the surface, Becky's eyes were always cold, especially whenever Carol received a promotion. Her attitude became increasingly unable to hide her irritation. Jake, unlike his mother, was a quiet and thoughtful boy. He was kind to Samantha. "Sammy, are you ready? It's time to go," Carol called, looking at her watch. Samantha nodded silently and put her homework in her bag. She took her mother's hand and said, "Mom, are we coming home early?" "Of course. We'll come right back after lunch with Grandma and the others. And I'm leaving on a business trip tomorrow, right? Let's spend lots of time together today." Carol gently squeezed her daughter's hand. She was scheduled to leave for a week-long trip to Switzerland the next day. It was an important trip to attend an international conference for new drug development. Harmonious family on the surface, she always felt anxious deep down. She wasn't unaware of the occasional cold attitude her mother and sister showed toward Samantha, but she interpreted it as minor reactions stemming from jealousy of her success and tried not to take it too seriously. "It'll be fine, they're family," Carol reassured herself. She believed in family bonds. "I'll say it one more time. I've prepared dinner in the bottom shelf of the refrigerator. You just need to heat it up. Make sure she takes her medicine on time, and don't forget about her allergies." At the boarding gate for Zurich, Carol emphasized these points to her mother over the phone. As the boarding announcement echoed behind her, she tried to dispel her anxiety. "I understand, Carol. How many times do I need to tell you?" There was a hint of irritation in Judith's voice. "I raised you, after all. I can certainly take care of my granddaughter." Carol took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm just worried. You focus on your important conference. Leave Samantha to me." Even after ending the call, a heavy weight remained in Carol's chest. She couldn't get Samantha's expression out of her mind. The night before her departure, her daughter had been quieter than usual, repeatedly asking, "Mom, do you have to go?" Despite having stayed at her grandmother's house many times before, she seemed unusually anxious this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the final boarding call for Flight 324 to Zurich." Prompted by the announcement, Carol headed toward the boarding gate with heavy steps. The conference in Zurich continued late into the night each day. Discussions with researchers at the forefront of the pharmaceutical industry were stimulating and brought new perspectives to Carol's research. On the third night, she finally returned to her hotel room and collapsed onto the bed, feeling tension in her muscles. The clock showed 2 a.m. Samantha would be asleep by now. Due to the time zone difference, it was still the previous evening in Boston. Carol checked her smartphone for messages from her daughter but found none. Usually her mother would send photos of Samantha almost daily, but this time, there had been unusually little contact. They must be busy, she told herself, and after a shower, lay down in bed. Though tired, falling asleep proved difficult. Outside the window, the illuminated Swiss cityscape glowed quietly. It was an hour later when she finally drifted into a light sleep. Carol jolted awake in the darkness to the shrill sound of the telephone. "Is this Miss Warner? This is Johnson from Boston General Hospital." The man's voice was calm, but Carol sensed the urgency hidden behind it. Her heart began to race. "Yes, this is Carol Warner. Your daughter Samantha Warner has been brought to our emergency room. She's in critical condition." The words beyond that point only vaguely reached Carol's ears. Fragmented phrases like fall from a height, head trauma, unconscious, preparing for surgery seemed to come from far away. "What do you mean?" Carol's voice trembled so much that it hardly seemed like her own. "Samantha should be at my mother and sister's house. An ambulance was dispatched following a call from your family. We're currently preparing for surgery. Could you come as soon as possible?" Immediately after hanging up, Carol dialed her mother's number. Her fingers were shaking so much that she misdialed several times. When she finally got through, she heard her mother's sleepy voice. "Hello? Carol? What do you want at this hour?" "Mom, what happened to Samantha? I got a call from the hospital." After a brief silence, shockingly, her mother's laughter came through the phone. "I don't know. She probably went off somewhere on her own. That child hasn't been listening lately." Carol couldn't believe her ears. "What are you saying?" "I got a call that Samantha was taken to the hospital. Boston General Hospital." "Oh, is that so? That's terrible." Judith's voice contained more annoyance than surprise. "I'll ask Becky." The call switched, and she heard her sister's voice. "Sis? What is it at this hour?" "Becky, what happened to Samantha?" "I hear she was taken to the hospital." "Oh, that child." Becky's voice held obvious indifference. "She wouldn't listen, and when I took my eyes off her she went somewhere. It's her own fault." Carol was speechless. Even though her daughter was in critical condition at the hospital, her mother and sister were acting as if they didn't care at all. Fear and anger swirled inside her. "Go to the hospital right now. I'll be on the next flight back." Fine. "Don't be so dramatic," Becky said with exasperation. "She probably just fell down." Carol hung up and immediately contacted the hotel front desk to arrange the earliest return flight. While hurriedly packing her suitcase, her mind was in a state of panic. What had Samantha been doing? What kind of accident had she been in? And above all, what was that abnormal response from her mother and sister? "Please, Samantha, be safe," she whispered, fighting back tears. 12 hours later, Carol stood in front of the intensive care unit at Boston General Hospital. Her face was pale from the consecutive flights and worry, but she listened desperately to the doctor's explanation. "Miss Warner, it appears your daughter fell from the roof of a 2-story house. She has a severe concussion, fractures in her left arm and 3 ribs, and mild internal organ damage. While there's no immediate danger to her life, it will take time for her to regain consciousness." Carol approached Samantha's bed with trembling legs as she listened to the doctor's words. The door to the room opened, revealing her daughter lying on a small white bed. Samantha's face was covered with bandages, her left arm was in a sling, and multiple tubes and machines were connected to her small body. Only the regular beeping sound announced the presence of life in this quiet room. Carol sat by her daughter's bedside and gently held her right hand, which wasn't covered in bandages. Touching the cold hand, she let out the tears she had been holding back. "Mommy is here, Samantha," she whispered. "It's okay, I'll protect you." The door to the room opened again, and her mother and sister entered. Carol looked up and froze at the sight of them. Judith was in perfect makeup and attire, dressed as if she were heading to lunch with friends. Becky also appeared in flashy clothes, inappropriate for the situation. Neither of their expressions showed the grief or regret Carol had expected. "Oh, so you did come," Judith said. "There was no need to be so dramatic." Carol stood up, trembling with anger. Something was wrong, very wrong. Why were her mother and sister so callous when her daughter's life was in danger? "What exactly happened?" Carol asked in a low voice. "Tell me precisely." Judith and Becky exchanged glances, wearing expressions that suggested they were hiding something. Samantha climbed onto the roof on her own, Becky answered casually. By the time we noticed, she had already fallen. Carol couldn't believe that explanation. 8-year-old Samantha was always a cautious child who rarely engaged in dangerous behavior. And above all, her mother and sister's attitudes were too unnatural. I want both of you to leave the room until you're ready to tell me the truth, Carol said coldly. The two showed dissatisfied expressions, but left the room without particular resistance. Carol returned to Samantha's side and gripped her small hand. She was determined. She wouldn't give up until she uncovered the truth about what had happened for Samantha's sake, and for her own. In the hospital waiting room, Carol reached for a freshly brewed coffee. Having barely slept for 3 days, her body was heavy with fatigue, and dark shadows had formed under her eyes. Still, she only left Samantha's bedside for short periods. Carol. Turning around, she saw her ex-husband Michael standing at the hospital entrance. He had returned urgently from Afghanistan. Still in his military uniform, he carried a large sports bag over his shoulder. Though he looked tired, his blue eyes showed strong determination. Michael. Carol stood up and was embraced by her former husband. Even though they had maintained a friendly relationship after their divorce, reuniting in such circumstances provided emotional support. Thank you for coming. I got on a plane right away. How's Samantha? She still hasn't regained consciousness, but the doctor says there are signs of recovery. Carol briefly explained the situation, Samantha's injuries and the unnatural attitude of her mother and sister. She could see Michael's face hardening with anger. Something's not right, Michael said in a low voice. Samantha climbing onto a roof by herself doesn't sound like her. I think so too. Mom and sis are hiding something. Michael frowned. Have you talked to the police? It's been reported as an accident. But Carol cut herself off. In her mind, the worst possibilities were beginning to take shape. I looked at Samantha's room yesterday. The guest room at Mom's house. There were iron marks on her clothes. Who makes an 8-year-old child iron? Michael's eyes darkened. I'll contact a friend of mine. I know someone in the Boston police. They headed to Samantha's hospital room. Seeing his daughter sleeping in the small bed, a pained expression crossed Michael's face. He gently kissed her bandaged head. I'm back, Sammy, he whispered. I'll protect you. The next day things took a dramatic turn. Carol was having lunch in the hospital cafeteria when Michael appeared with a police officer. Carol, this is Detective Thomas. I'd like you to hear what he has to say. Detective Thomas was a composed man in his mid-40s with eyes full of deep empathy. He sat across from Carol. Miss Warner, we received a call from the parent of one of your daughter's classmates. Jake Griffin, your niece's cousin, apparently told something to the school counselor. Carol took a sharp breath. Jake? What did he say? We're still confirming the details, but it seems to be about the circumstances of the day of the accident, which differ from the testimony of your mother and sister. Detective Thomas chose his words carefully. The school counselor was concerned about Jake's story and reported it to the authorities. Carol lifted her coffee cup with trembling hands. Can I see Jake? We're arranging that now. A lawyer will also be present for him, as Child Protective Services are involved. Michael placed his hand on Carol's shoulder. The warmth of his hand gave her a little comfort. Whatever the truth is, we'll face it together, he said quietly. 2 hours later, in a small conference room at the hospital, Carol and Michael met with Jake. The 10-year-old boy looked smaller than usual, and his eyes were swollen. A representative from Child Protective Services and a lawyer appointed for him were present. Jake, don't be scared, Carol spoke gently. You just need to tell us the truth. The boy bit his trembling lip, and began speaking in a small voice, looking at the floor. Mom was always mean to Sammy. He stumbled over his words. Grandma too. When Sammy wasn't around, they'd say, that girl is too uppity. Carol tried to hide her distress. What happened on the day of the accident? Mom tried to make Sammy clean the roof. Jake's voice was halting. Leaves were stuck in the gutters. I said I would do it, but Mom said, let Sammy do it. Because Mom said, if Sammy doesn't listen, let's give her a little scare. The air in the room froze. Sammy was scared, but she started climbing the ladder. Mom and Grandma were inside. I followed Sammy. When Sammy slipped, I tried to grab her, but I wasn't fast enough. Jake began to cry loudly. It wasn't my fault. I tried to help. The Child Protective Services representative embraced him. It's not your fault, Jake. Carol was at a loss for words. Michael's hand gripped hers tightly. What happened after that? Detective Thomas asked gently. Sammy didn't move. I screamed. Mom and Grandma came, and Mom cried at first. But Grandma said, it's okay, we're not responsible. We'll say she climbed up on her own. Carol stood up and walked toward the window. Her body was shaking with anger and sadness. They were slow to call an ambulance. Jake continued. Grandma said at first, let's just see how she is. But Sammy was bleeding, so I begged them several times. Detective Thomas judged that he had obtained sufficient testimony and thanked Jake. After the boy left the room, he turned to Carol and Michael. "We have enough evidence. We'll arrest your mother and sister on suspicion of abuse and violation of duty to provide aid." In the early evening, Carol was talking with the doctor in the hospital hallway when she saw Judith and Becky being escorted by police officers. "Misunderstanding," Judith desperately shouted. "We didn't do anything. Sis, please, Jake is lying. Help us." Becky also cried out. Carol looked at them with cold eyes. "Samantha woke up," she said quietly. "She told me everything." In reality, Samantha had not yet fully regained consciousness. But seeing how this lie transformed Judith and Becky's expressions, Carol was convinced of the truth. The color drained from their faces, especially Judith, who seemed at a loss for words, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "You endangered my child and then delayed getting her help." Carol's voice was as cold as ice. "I'll never forgive you." After the police officers took them away, Michael stood by Carol's side. "The investigation suggests there was regular abuse," he said quietly. "Samantha probably didn't tell you because she was worried about you." Carol wept. She hadn't truly protected Samantha. She never imagined that her mother and sister's jealousy of her success would be directed at her daughter in this way. "Things will be different now," Carol said with determination. "I will absolutely protect Samantha." At that moment, a nurse hurriedly approached. "Miss Warner? Your daughter has regained consciousness." Carol and Michael began to run. Finally, a ray of light was breaking through this nightmarish situation. A solemn atmosphere pervaded the grand courtroom of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Tension filled the high-ceilinged room among the people who packed the spectator seats. 3 weeks had passed since the trial began, and today was the day for the prosecution's closing arguments against Judith Griffin and Becky Griffin. Carol sat with her back straight, staring at the backs of the two defendants seated in front. Her mother and sister, once important figures in her life now, felt like strangers. Judith's graying hair had turned completely white since the trial began, and Becky's glamour had vanished. "I'm by your side." Michael squeezed her hand. He was seated on her left, having changed into formal attire from his military uniform. After returning from Afghanistan, he had requested a transfer to a military base near Boston for Samantha's sake. The situation was terrible, but ironically, it had brought the family closer together again. Samantha, who was continuing rehabilitation, wasn't in court today. 2 months after the accident, she was recovering well physically, but her emotional wounds were deep. She needed weekly sessions with a psychotherapist. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Martha Reed stood up. She was a stern-looking woman in her 40s, known for her high conviction rate in child abuse cases. "This case is not merely an accident. It is an example of deliberate harm to a child and subsequent intentional cover-up." The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor organized the sequence of events while displaying evidence photos one by one: the dangerous slope of the roof Samantha had been made to climb, the unnaturally old clothes found in Samantha's room, and most decisively, the recorded testimony of Jake. The defendants treated an 8-year-old girl as a tool for household chores and forced her to perform dangerous work. And after the accident occurred, their first thought was self-preservation. The jurors' expressions hardened. Several elderly women in particular looked at Judith with severe eyes. "However, most shocking is that they deliberately delayed calling an ambulance," the prosecutor continued. "According to the doctor's testimony, this 30-minute delay may have significantly affected the victim's recovery." Carol closed her eyes. When photos from immediately after the accident were displayed on the courtroom screen, she felt a tightness in her chest. The sight of Samantha's small body lying on the ground was like a nightmare. The most touching testimony in this trial came from 10-year-old Jake Griffin. The prosecutor changed her tone. Despite his fear of his mother and grandmother, he had the courage to tell the truth. That was only possible because he truly cared about his cousin. Michael shifted in his seat. He had promised to do his best for Jake as well. The boy was currently under the protection of Child Protective Services and receiving regular counseling. The defense attorneys seemed to slump their shoulders under the weight of evidence. Judith's lawyer tried to claim misunderstanding of family relationships, and Becky's lawyer attempted to excuse it as a temporary lapse in judgment, but they were powerless in the face of Jake's testimony. But they were powerless in the face of Jake's testimony. The next day, the judge's stern expression brought tension to the entire courtroom. "Judith Griffin and Becky Griffin. Both defendants have been." Carol held her breath. Michael's arm firmly supported her shoulder. "Judith Griffin, you are sentenced to a fine of $100,000 and a 2-year suspended sentence. Additionally, I order you to pay $200,000 in damages to the victim." The color drained from Judith's face. It meant she would lose most of her retirement savings. "Becky Griffin, you are sentenced to 3 years of probation. Also, as determined by the juvenile court, your parental rights over your son Jake Griffin will be restricted, and for the next year, You will only have supervised visitation. Becky began to cry out loud. For her, separation from Jake was the harshest punishment. Furthermore, both defendants are prohibited from unsupervised contact with minors for the next 10 years. This includes contact with the victim, Samantha Warner. After the sentence was passed, Carol stood quietly next to Michael outside the courtroom. Media cameras were pointed at them, but they remained silent. "Do you have any comment?" a reporter asked. Carol thought for a moment and quietly answered, "We are now focusing on Samantha's recovery. We have no further comment." In Boston news, this case of abuse by grandmother and aunt was reported daily. Especially, Judith's fall from social prominence attracted much attention. The requests for her resignation from charitable organizations and excommunication from her church community were major blows to her. "Look at this." Michael turned his laptop screen. He and Carol were in the cafeteria of the hospital where Samantha was staying. "It seems Becky has been fired from the real estate company where she worked." Carol nodded while sipping her coffee. Mom called again. She was crying that she has no money. "How did you respond?" "I didn't say anything." Carol gazed out the window. "I don't feel anything now. No anger, no sadness, just emptiness." Michael placed his hand on her shoulder. He understood Carol's pain, how painful it is to completely lose trust in family. Michael's dad. Turning around, they saw Samantha coming down the hallway in a wheelchair. Next to her stood William Warner, Michael's father and a former judge. The dignified man in his 70s was gently watching over his granddaughter. "I was reading her library books," William explained. "She's recovering remarkably quickly." Carol and Michael smiled. When William learned of this incident, he had come right away. His legal advice and emotional support had been a great strength during this difficult time. "Mom, do you think I can go back to school next week?" Samantha asked. There was more confidence in her voice than before. "We'll consult with the doctor first." Carol gently stroked her daughter's hair. "But before that, we need to go see our new house." Samantha's eyes lit up. "Near Dad's place?" "Yes. A new beginning for the three of us." As Carol embraced her daughter, she gazed at the blue sky outside the window. A long road of recovery lay ahead of them, but at least now they were safe. And that was the most important thing. 1 year later, the trees were beginning to change color in a quiet residential area of suburban Boston. In the yard of a 2-story White House, Samantha was playing basketball with her friends. Having fully recovered from the accident, she had become more active than before, now a confident 10-year-old girl. "Nice shot, Sammy," Michael called from the edge of the yard. While continuing his work as a military doctor, his transfer to a nearby base allowed him to spend regular time with his daughter. By the window, Carol smiled with a coffee in hand. After negotiating with the pharmaceutical company, she had been granted flexible hours and the ability to work from home 3 days a week. She had prioritized balancing time with family and work. "Dad, can I invite Jake next time?" Samantha asked, holding the ball. Of course, Michael gently stroked his daughter's hair. Jake was currently living in a foster home under the supervision of Child Protective Services. Michael and Carol were supporting his counseling costs and had arranged visits twice a month. Jake was gradually recovering from his emotional wounds, and his relationship with his cousin Samantha was slowly being repaired. "There's a letter," Carol told Michael as he returned to the living room. The envelope bore a familiar handwriting. "It's from Mom." Michael frowned. "What does it say?" "She's asking for help again. Says she can't pay for the nursing home," Carol quietly answered, "and Becky is struggling with work and living in a cheap apartment." Since the sentencing, Judith and Becky's lives had taken a drastic turn for the worse. Judith had lost her savings to the high compensation and had been abandoned by her friends. Becky had bounced between low-paying jobs and could only see Jake during supervised visits once a week. Their relationship had also collapsed, reduced to blaming each other. "What do you plan to do?" Michael asked. Looking out the window at Samantha playing happily, Carol said, "Nothing. I don't intend to see them until Samantha says she forgives them." "A wise decision," Michael agreed. "Samantha has been able to recover so well because she had a safe environment." They sat silently in the living room, gazing at the fire in the fireplace. The sound of children's laughter came through the window. "Sometimes I think," Carol said, cradling her coffee cup in both hands, "if I hadn't gone on that business trip, stop blaming yourself." Michael squeezed her hand. "You're a good mother. No parent is perfect. What's important is protecting your child with all your might when they're in danger. And that's what you did." Carol smiled. Outside the window, Samantha made a successful drive, and her friends cheered. "A new beginning," she whispered. She had learned much over this year. That blood ties alone don't make a family. That love means protection and sometimes involves difficult choices, and above all, that the truth always comes to light. In the gentle wind that rustled the trees in the yard, Carol and Michael smiled quietly at each other. A long road still lay ahead of them, but this moment was peaceful. That was enough.